When it comes to note taking, there's all kinds of devices in the world, software programs, and things that I like to use, like the memory palace technique. But one particular thinker about a particular technology is named Aidan Helfant, and he's really, really into Obsidian in particular, but also a great explainer of techniques like the memory palace and then using them in conjunction with softwares. So, in this episode of the Magnetic Memory Method podcast, I want to introduce you to Aidan and have a conversation about how he got into memory, how he is using note taking software in an optimal way in order to get all of that wonderful recall goodness without falling into the traps of rote learning. So, without further ado, let's dive into this conversation with Aidan Helfant from aidanhelfant.com. Aidan, you're a young fellow. You should have optimal memory at your age. What draws you to memory techniques?
Well, I actually got into them firstly from you about 9 months ago, I think. When I first came to college, not that interested in learning intrinsically. I remember I used to read tons when I was a kid, books for hours and hours in bed. But when I got to middle and high school, that love for learning started to die out as I was forced to do readings for class and do tests and assignments. And I stopped my reading habit for a long time, instead resorting to video games and toxic dieting to uh, mesh with my lost love for learning. But when I got to college, I knew something needed to change because the techniques that I'd used inside of high school for doing well were no longer working. I wasn't able to just read a textbook blatantly and go into the test, do well. So I started to dive into the learning sphere of like all sorts of stuff like cognitive science. I learned about psychology. And eventually I stumbled upon your YouTube channel and also your book, The Victorious Mind, which led me down a whole rabbit hole of learning about learning and also memory and memory palaces. So we can go from there where you'd like.
Right, right. Well, I jump on the age thing just because I know that there's a lot of research that shows age issues start much earlier than we think. But I'm
Mhm.
quite curious now. You mentioned high school. What were you doing in high school before you went to college?
I was living in a really rural town, like the middle of nowhere, if the middle of nowhere had a middle of nowhere, Hamilton, New York. So I wasn't doing much, to be honest. I was playing video games. I was playing like sports, soccer and tennis, and mostly taking the classes that were in high school. So my life was pretty normal by all standards. But to comment on your memory comment about like how memory, even in people my age, can already start to deteriorate. I've actually noticed that very much in my own generation. I think one of the reasons that my generation in particular doesn't seem to have a very good memory for like even basic stuff is because of our reliance on digital devices. I didn't have a phone until I was 14. And even when I got one, it was a track phone. So I didn't have a digital phone with social media on it until I was 16. And I am so grateful that my parents didn't give me that digital phone until then,
Right.
because I feel like I was so much better at focusing than some of the other students in my school because I wasn't constantly exposed to the stimulation of social media and this other stuff. And I really feel like that ability to focus had a lot to do with my memory not deteriorating as much before, as much as the other students around me.
Right, right. Yeah, that's interesting. I never would have faced that issue because I didn't have my first cell phone till I was almost through my BA. And it was
Mm.
a old Nokia, and the most sophisticated game that it had on there was Snake or whatever. It's just this digital blocks going around, and it was, very boring game. Didn't spend too much time on that. So yeah, I can see that as being a great blessing from your parents. What
Yeah.
gave them the wherewithal, being in Hamilton, New York, in the middle of nowhere, or were they thinking ahead of what's going on, or did they have painful experiences with digital amnesia, or what was the thinking behind that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the big reasons was they're both teachers and they experienced upfront what it is like to have students that are unable to pay attention to what they're
Mm,
trying to teach.
right.
So, my dad's a Russian literature professor, and my mom is a biology and chemistry teacher. And they have both told me horror stories of students literally not being able to answer a question that they directly asked them because they straight up weren't paying attention for the entire class and they don't even know like what would even go into answering the question at all.
Wow.
And I think that that translated itself to the way they raised us is they didn't want to have us become the same students that they were seeing in their classes.
Well, that's great that they're using that insight in this way. So, when it comes to your work that you're doing through your YouTube channel and your blog, which is aidanhelfant.com, at the end, Aidan, and
Yes.
Helfant. Is that right? I'm testing my memory here.
You got it. You got it.
One of the things that leaps out at me in what you're doing, and I think it probably is something that's very interesting to a lot of people, is you're still using digital technologies, but you're kind of
Mhm.
bouncing them into the ancient art of memory. So what's the
Mm.
history behind that, and what draws you to these technologies? How do you know that the technologies are giving you a benefit? And then if they have a benefit, why do they still need the memory palace?
Mm. Oh, there's so many good questions in there. Oh my God. So I think the first way I'll attack that is by recognizing that I am Gen Z. And I think that's really important because I'm part of the first generation that grew up with the internet and with digital devices for their entire life, right? Millennials, the internet came while they were growing up. So the reason that's important is in many people in my generation tend to not to see the online world as separate from real life, but rather as an integral symbiosis with real life. Whereas people in older generations, I think, tend to see the online world as a completely separate entity from real life. So the reason I say that is that innately draws me more to digital stuff off the bat, more so than someone that's older might be drawn to. As for your second question, why do I use how do I use digital technology in alignment with memory palaces and other memory techniques? I see them as very helpful with each other. So let me give an example of like one of the digital technologies I use and how I find it helpful alongside memory palaces. One of the note-taking apps, or the major note-taking app I use, is Obsidian, which is a linked-based note-taking system that allows you to connect notes together using bidirectional links. You can make your own Wikipedia in a sense, because you can create one note and connect it to another note, a personal Wikipedia. So when I am taking notes from books, for instance, or from a podcast I'm listening to, or from a lecture, I will often take notes using Obsidian, and I will try and over time through a number of systems that I have, which I could go into later if you wanted to, but I will, through a number of systems and habits in my life, integrate them into my content creation in like writing form. However, sometimes there are pieces of information that I think are so valuable that I want to, what I say, download them into my first brain, because I recognize the second brain of Obsidian and my first brain are not the same, right? Making connections in Obsidian is not the same as making connections in my first brain. It doesn't work like that. That would be sick if it did, but it does not, unfortunately. So when for a lot of the books that I've created summaries on in Obsidian, I have actually gone through and memorized them inside of a memory palace using the magnetic memory method. I've created memory palace, created magnetic imagery for each of the major insights that I took from the book, which I've worded in my own words in the summary as well, making it even more like powerful and sticky in my mind. And then I often don't really have to go to the summary anymore because it's in my first brain. Mm-hmm. So the reason I like the digital nature off the bat is it lets me do the connecting, the seeing, like the understanding of the material at first, connecting it to other writings that I've created, other books that I've read. And then once I've made the summary, that's when I like to do the memorization. So that's how they work together.
So you're a blogger. What is the fundamental difference between publicly sharing your notes and privately using a technology like Obsidian?
Oh, that's such a good question. You know, I actually think that the way that I am using Obsidian, it's starting to mesh those two together. And what I mean by that is I have a Obsidian Publish. And what that means is that all my notes that I choose are actually published to the web. So anybody can see them if they go onto my Obsidian Publish website, which is so cool because that means that they can see the workings of my thinking instead of just the finished product. So to answer your question, I think the difference between the stuff that I post on the blog and the stuff on my Obsidian Publish website, usually the stuff I post on the blog is more fleshed out thoughts with a clear bridge of transformation that I'm trying to bring people through. Like you start one way, you end another. And whereas in my Obsidian Publish vault, oftentimes it's each note, it's not trying to change you in some way. It's just each note has my thinking inside of it. So they're not fleshed out yet.
So when you're blogging, you're trying to change or create a change.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting.
Yeah, bridge of transformation.
So that suggests there's something wrong or lacking in the status quo or in a group. Do you see it that way, or is it? I mean, I'm not criticizing it. I'm just curious how you frame it. Do you have a sense of a battle or a war in your mind, or how do you think of it?
I don't think I see it as a war. I see it more as a suggestion. I would never post a blog and write inside of it saying you have to do this. Like I feel like I am first off, I'm only 20 and I have not lived I cannot possibly say I know everything about how people should live. So I think the attitude that I try and exude in my writing is less this is what you have to do and more this is what I have found to help me. You could try it. If it works for you, it does. If it doesn't, that's okay too.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I ask these things because, when you think about these different generations, I guess I'm Gen X. I don't know. I kind of don't want to be associated or self-associate with these things, but they certainly have a function and are useful categories in some senses.
Yeah.
Do you have any sense of like, would you, if you had the chance, you could go back into the 80s or something, would you want to experience what that was like to be in a transition period or even further back to
Oh,
pre-dial-up
wow.
or something like that? Or do you have just total comfort in the world you find yourself thrown into?
Oh, that wow, what a wild question. Man. I I think for a day or so that would be incredible. But if you told me like I mean if you reworded that question it could be like would you like to leave every loved one in your life and transition to a period where you know nobody?
Right,
That's
right, right.
I would probably say no. But I do think that in a sense you could probably relate to this. Uh we do that in a way when we engage with interesting books and the authors of those books. It's I like to think when I'm reading a book that I'm having a conversation with the author. So even if they're long dead and I'm reading a book by them, you can almost transport yourself back to that time. It's obviously not going to be the same as if you were there, but yeah, like I got my Meditations by Marcus Aurelius in here, and whenever I'm reading that, it feels like Marcus is right next to me, and I'm talking to him. And we're having a good conversation. Do you ever feel the same way, or am I just like crazy?
Well, I don't feel that way with Marcus because I find the meditations to to be easy to sort of like there's a lot of reification of nature. There's a clear belief in time, which I think is problematic. And as Nietzsche pointed out, the problem with the Stoics is that there's more than one of them. But no, I don't feel in dialogue with Marcus Aurelius. But nonetheless, I know that dialogue feeling, and I would say that that's one of the best recipes or the best techniques or strategies for not being bored. So when I do
Mm,
get bored with various proto self-help Stoics, not that Aurelius ever called himself a Stoic, but he is called a Stoic. I don't think he ever called himself a Stoic anyway. But nonetheless, when I find myself having to read that for research or whatever, pretending I'm in dialogue with it is one of the best ways to stay engaged against the boredom. Look, even some of my favorite writers can be really dreadfully boring. So
mm.
I find that dialogue technique very useful. And of course, some of the best philosophers had dialogue, right? So Plato is dialogue. Marcus Aurelius is having a dialogue with himself in many regards. Bruno, even the great memory master, wrote dialogues. It's a wonderful literary form that we have lost, but we can strategically bring it into play. So
Mm,
I get that. I get that a lot as a great strategy for reading anything. And
mm,
you mentioned systems, so it'd be cool to get
mm.
into your systems. But how are we defining system? What is a system? Are we talking learning system, memory system? Is there a difference? What do you mean by system?
Yeah. So by system, I meant it can differ depending upon what you're talking about. Like for instance, I have a content creation system, which is the repeated method through which I come up with ideas, research, write, edit, and publish. But then I also have a system for journaling and reflection in my Obsidian database. So yeah, it really depends like what you wanted to dive into, and also like a system for memorizing using memory palaces from the things that I've consumed. So systems everywhere.
Right, right. So when you set one up, what do you go through? What's the process like?
I think to create a system like that for either content creation or memory palace or uh, a journaling and reflection, I always like to start with figuring out what are people already doing that I respect. So like I'll go online, I'll see, okay, my favorite content creator that I've been watching for a while, like what is his system for creating content? I'll figure that out. Okay, I'll reverse engineer. That's what he's doing. And then I'll try it. I will reflect upon what it was like to try it for myself. And then I'll make changes. And I think that the last part is really important, the making changes, because a system is just that, it's a system, but it doesn't mean that it'll work for you, right? It might work for someone else, but you need to figure out how to personalize it to your own life. So like one system that you might be familiar with is the magnetic memory method for memorizing using memory palaces. And when I was first getting into using that, I used it exactly as you were advocating for in the Victorious Mind. I would uh, plot out a alphabetical memory palace list. Then when I wanted to memorize something, I would choose something I choose a location based off of the alphabet using the index. Then I would map it out inside of a memory journal. Then I would actually write out the stations and then create the magnetic encodings using like cave cogs. And then I would do recall rehearsal for over the next few days, weeks, months, and hopefully years. At first, that worked like fantastically. I loved your system, was great. But then came the personalized step. And that was very important for me because one thing that I did to personalize the process a bit for me is I didn't stick completely to the recall rehearsal timing that you talk about in the book, which I think is like you talk about Dominic O'Brien's recall rehearsal timing, which is like once the first day, once a week later, once a month later, and then once 3 months later. But I found that I had a bit of some of the things I wanted to memorize had different timings compared to not only that, but also the one that I think you talked about, which is a little bit more often than Dominic O'Brien's. So I would be more I would change how much I recall rehearsed based off of the information that I was memorizing. Like, did I really want to get it in mind, or did I want to let it be a little bit less like completely ingrained?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, the personalization is so key to it all. It's really, I would think magnetic memory method boils down to the method for creating your own highly personalized systems, but then also discovering that the system is really just harnessing some natural process you would need to be doing one way or the other. It's just optimizing it, right? And personalizing it. So that's cool that you found that. Do you have any insight into how that you were able to work this all out? And I ask because I find that there's people who get it immediately. They just totally understand this
Mm.
and they run with it. Others, perhaps because they've had too much digital exposure at a young age. I mean, do you think that sort of helped you with the attention span? Because I think there's granular details that really matter in the learning of quote unquote a proper art of memory. So I'm wondering if some of
Uh-huh.
the struggles that people have is they just don't have the attention span to get the big picture overview.
Mm,
You know,
mm.
so I'm just curious.
That's a Yeah, that's another great question. I think what I'll preface before I answer is I don't want to make it sound like I've got it in its entirely. I think I knew actually about the memory palace technique, uh, which I didn't say earlier before I saw your channel, like maybe 4 years ago. But back then I'd heard it and I was like, I don't need to do that. There's no way that's necessary. So I was one of those people that like had heard about it, saw how incredible, powerful it was, but still didn't act until like 2 years later. As for why I think it worked out for me, I think the biggest reason is that I understood once I found your channel how important application is for learning. And the reason for that was because of my experience creating content over the past year and a half before I found you. When I was creating content on YouTube, on my blog, on a podcast, I came like face to face with how effective it is to apply what you learn. Because what is the process of content creation force you to do, at least if you're doing educational content, forces you to take your learnings, distill them into written form or video form or audio form if you're doing a podcast, and then try and help someone, teach someone else to learn the same thing. It's like the ultimate form of learning. Like you're not only like uh distilling what you've read, but then you have to teach it to someone else. So I came face to face with how important that application was. So then when I came to you and I heard about using the memory palace technique, and I heard you say like over and over again during the videos, like, apply it, please. Don't be one of those people that hears about it and then is like, oh, I got it, I don't have to do it, and then never does it, because you're not going to get it until you do it. And that is so true. Like you really don't get it until you do it, because it just doesn't make sense. Uh, it's like I can't say it any other way. It's,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it's really it's interesting the amount of people who are willing to criticize it, and I understand that not everybody can engage with every little thing that I put out there, but it sometimes surprises people when they're like, "Well, what about anatomy? What would you know about anatomy?" And I'm like, "Well, here's your scaphoid and the carpal bones. Here's your lunate. Here's your triangular. Here's the pisiform. Like, I go all through them, right?" And it's I actually do exactly what you just pointed out. Like I apply the techniques to my own anatomy, come up with little things like, oh, so the blood is deoxygenated when it comes into the right side of the heart. What am I going to do for this? And then it's oxygenated in the left side. So rocks versus locks, like right side deoxygenated. Imagine this old band, all tired, Rolling Stones maybe, or Roxy Music, which goes with rocks. And then, like all this sort of stuff, I actually do it. And then
Yeah.
it actually sticks with me. Now, I'm not a doctor or not a medical doctor, but it is that kind of thing where I can teach you how to do it because I've learned a lot of anatomy just by actually applying it. So it's cool that you're doing that. And I think that is the key, is that if you don't do these techniques, they will forever evade you. I would have never understood it if I hadn't taken action with the techniques, because it is kind of counterintuitive that it would work that way. And I would say we have the scientific problem, which is that any true scientist doesn't understand. Understanding is always yet to come. It's forever
Mm.
evading us because of the falsifiability rule that science is here to falsify, not to verify, but to falsify. So we keep testing it. We keep trying to find that limit. So in
Mm.
that spirit or vein or theme, where have you found limits with learning technology, whether it's ancient technology of the memory palace or it's the most recent things that you're playing around with? Where do you personally go, that's where I am stopped? And do you want to transcend it, or are you just happy with the borders that you've found?
Oh, yeah. Oh, fascinating. I think what I've come to realize, and actually, I'd be really interested to hear your experience with this after I answer this, is that the memory palace technique becomes exponentially more powerful the more that you do it, because it becomes your brain starts to be able to create the imagery without you even having to consciously think about it. So when I first started using the memory palace technique, I remember I sat down and I was memorizing my insights from the book Drive by Daniel H. Pink. And it was agony. Like, it took forever. Like, I had to figure out how to create an image for every single one of these insights that I'd taken. But because I was so unused to coming up with imagery, it took me a long time just to create one image. However, as I kept going, as I kept doing more books, more uh, memorizing the with the major system, and I even memorized like Lynn Kelly's bestiary that she shares inside of her the memory code. I found that the images started to just appear out of seemingly thin air. And I started to be able to memorize faster. So I think that I've reached the point where I know that there's so much more still to go. Like, I'm still slow in a number of areas, especially if I'm uh, memorizing numbers. I haven't fleshed out I haven't made the major system like subconscious yet. But I know that there's always the ability to go further if I wanted to. Like, if I got really into memory sometime, I know, because of how much I've been improved over the last year, that I could, like the memory champions do, like just spend all my time memorizing cards and get really fast. Is that something I want to do though? I think I would hit diminishing returns at that point. But this is where I wanted to ask you, is like, what has your experience been with the limits of the memory palace technique, as well as like the speed of coming up with imagery over the course of your practice?
Well, there certainly are, I think, externally imposed limits. So, for example,
Mm-hmm.
I was joking that Marcus Aurelius believes in time, but at some level there is time, right? There's a clock that times things. So there's going to be externally imposed limits no matter how fast memory competitors get, because in order to measure how fast they memorize, you have to have a measurement of time, and then there's going to be some kind of summit that probably can't be reached, but maybe not. I don't know. It can be that they just get more and more granular ways of measuring time, and people will use techniques at a rapid space or a rapid rate within whatever space they measure. That, I think, is one limit. And I got invited to be the commentator at the 2023 Pan American Open, and they were memorizing cloud formations. And so, to me, that's a limit. It's an internally imposed limit, because in my practice, I would, first of all, I don't want to practice to compete. Been there, done that for charity, and that's kind of cool and fun and everything like that. But I don't think I would ever give any of them the honor of toppling any of their records. So that's kind of a limit. I think it's honorable to not step into a ring that you're not going to practice for. You know what I mean? But also
Yeah.
where I see it going, that okay, so we're going to do clouds and something like that. I think that's amazing, but I don't want to practice to be prepared for that kind of thing that I would never do in real life. So in my own practice, where real life comes in and the limits that I found, the only limits I found are health. And I don't always get to choose when I have like an episode of a chronic illness that I have. So that sort of is a battle that is neither internally nor externally imposed. It's just mysterious, right? But that's really the main limit. As long as the information is encoded in words, numbers, symbols, maybe figures that are different than words, numbers, and symbols, I haven't yet really seen that I can't memorize it. Then one last thing area where I don't really see it so much as a limit as I don't see it as being mnemonic necessarily, which is choreography and some aspects of music, which are essentially choreographic in nature. So what I mean by that is, if you take something that has to do with where your body is in space relative to a floor, like dance moves, that seems to me so heavily in procedural memory, perspective memory, something that is not always necessarily, well, let's cook up a memory technique for that. That's where almost rote repetition is not a bad thing, going through the ropes to nail that. Same thing in music. There's an aspect to music that just simply isn't semantic. It doesn't really matter if you know that that's a C. You know, you need to be able to find all the C's on the fretboard, period. And you don't have to, you need to be able to do it without thinking. And there's a level to that is choreography. It is not mnemonic knowledge. It's not semantic knowledge where, oh, you don't have time. Like, you have to be able to just find those things, especially if you're going to do any kind of improvisational music, right? So, but it's still basically dance floor. This is where the fingers need to be on the floor of the fretboard, and that is, again, it's like perspective memory meeting procedural memory, meeting something that I don't think we understand. So that's a limit. And people ask me about music all the time. And ultimately I say, look, I actually don't need to know the name of this note to tell you more or less where the second phrase in the guitar solo that Marty Friedman plays in Symphony of Destruction, it's just this really cool lick, right? And I know what that note is if I think about it, but I actually can just go on my fretboard and start to play that lick without anything related to what mode it's in, what scale, he might be choosing. It doesn't really matter,
Yeah.
I can tell you all kinds of things about, the first note, like, okay, we can do an analysis, F and G and like E, like, whoa, that's really far from my mind when I've played Symphony of Destruction on the stage with my band. We just need to play the song. So I think that's a limit. Music, movement, where I don't have mnemonic strategies for them, because I don't really see that they're mnemonic in nature. They're something else.
I did have one comment on that, which I thought that was fascinating, by the way. And now I see where you were going with the limit, more so. I think everything you said, totally can see how mnemonic strategies wouldn't be as helpful for them. However, I have heard from Andrew Huberman on a podcast that I listened to about the power of visualization exercises in helping hone your procedural memory for certain athletic endeavors. So, for instance, some professional tennis players actually have a memory practice a memory routine they do every now and then, where they visualize themselves in the first person doing a tennis serve, or hitting a forehand. And because your brain, when you're imagining yourself doing a movement or seeing someone else even do it, doesn't it does the same, it activates the same regions as if you were actually doing it, minus that you muscles are inhibited from acting it out. It actually helps you build skill in that, build procedural memory for that thing. Does that relate to what you were talking about with the limits of memory
Yeah.
palace training?
There's something to that for sure. I mean, I used to do that all the time before we would go out on stage when I was on tour. I would go through
Mm-hmm.
all the songs, visualizing total success and so forth. The only thing is that that's an additive measure. It's a supplement,
Mm.
and it is completely, maybe not completely, but it's going to be close to completely useless if you don't put in the time actually
Mm.
rehearsing and so forth. So what you're doing there, I don't know that you're actually supplementing your procedural memory in any direct way. I don't know for tennis, but it's a performance. So I think that if you're not putting in the reps, there's nothing to supplement basically through visualization. I don't know which studies Huberman's looking at, and at the end of the day, I think it still comes down to a personalization thing. And I'll bet you there are
Yeah.
people who don't spend time visualizing, you know. But
Oh yeah.
this
Yeah.
this would be an almost, Think and Grow Rich level investigation where Napoleon Hill goes and talks to all these people to figure out, what are the secrets behind your thing. And if we talk to Steve Vai in music, or we talk to whoever in golf, Tiger Woods or whatever, I would predict, my hypothesis would be is that you'd probably have it 50-50 down the line. There are top performers who previs, and there are top performers who don't. I can't see that being the game changer, really. Honestly,
Yeah.
I can't. But then again, I'm also the rare bird who's just like, Aurelius, are you kidding? So I'm happy to be wrong on that if it turns out differently. But notice
Yeah.
too, even in the memory world, there are memory competitors who can't see images in their mind anyway, and they're still quite impressive in what they do. I was talking with Nelson Dellis not that long ago, and he was like, "Yeah, I don't have time to see images in my mind." Right? And so other competitors
Mm.
do say that they see images when they're competing. To me, it's not even an interesting question. It is you have it is an interesting question because other people have the question, but to me, it's not an interesting question because of the nature of mental imagery. So, what is a mental experience, first of all, right? And to me, that's the interesting limit, is that I can only have so many mental experiences, and they're paradoxical because think of the universe, for example, right? How can I
Mhm.
think about the universe and have an image or an idea, a mental image, not necessarily a picture image, but an imaginary image of infinity expanding as we speak, when by the definition of infinity, I could never reach its outer edge to confirm that it even has an outer edge, right? So
Mm.
this is like mental chaos in a way. It's so wonderfully strange and frustrating and confusing, because theoretically there can be no limit to what the mind can do, because it is the thing that that experiences the concept of both limit and limitlessness, right? So this is why Bruno starts 30 statues with abit ergo chaos, non statuem non figuram. It is chaos because you can't make a statue for it. You can't make a figure for it in your mind. And yet you could talk about it using statues and figures, as he calls it. So at the end of the day, I don't know. I think that there's at least two kinds of people: those who pre-visualize and those who don't. And I bet you it comes halfway down the line in a big test study.
Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. I remember actually I got my brother into Memory Palace training a few months ago because of me telling him about it. And he happens to be one of the people that I believe you talk about, what is it? And Aphantasia? Is that what
Aphantasia,
you
yeah,
can't?
yeah, yeah, Yeah.
Yeah, aphantasia. Yeah, he has aphantasia, so he cannot see in his mind the images. But it's funny because as he tells me about the images, I instinctually imagine them, visualize them in my mind. So yeah, it's like it really, like you said, there is two people, and uh, they can both get the benefits of memory training.
Yeah,
Um,
I really don't understand the difference. I remember talking to a fellow with aphantasia, and he has the same name as a character in the movie Jaws, and he was
mm,
even telling me, my recall of the exact discussion is I never memorized it, but it had something to do with like he remembered a time where he met somebody in a parking lot, and the person said his name. He said, "Oh, like that character in Jaws, right?" And I said,
mhm.
you telling me that memory is a mental image. That's what a mental image is, you know? Like what else would it be? The parking lot is now a memory palace. Whether you see it in your mind or not, you have somehow in your brain remembered someone say, "Hey, my name's Quint." Oh, like that guy in Jaws, right? Now, you might not see the shark in your mind at that moment, but you have something going on that is mental content, mental stuff. It's in your repository of mental content, right? And when you saw Jaws or you see the poster or you think of Steven Spielberg, those fun pictures of him like sitting on a shark statue or whatever it is, right? Like your ability of your mouth to say those words requires some sort of inner experience. And I think that the inner experience is exactly what people mean when they say, "Oh, yeah, I can visualize that." But they don't necessarily
Mm.
visualize it as if it's like HD television in their minds. They might say that they do, but how do we know that because they say that they do, that's actually what's happening? We don't, right?
Mm.
And the studies show
No.
that aphantasic brain versus the highly visual person's brain, the same centers are lighting up, right? So what is it?
Yeah, what is it? I
I think it's a
that
thought
is
virus is what it
fascinating.
is. I think that some no, I'm not kidding. If you look at the
Uh-huh.
history of the term aphantasia, it is proof that it doesn't exist because people have come up with the idea that, oh, that's me. I don't have that, right? They have imagined their
Mm.
way into confirming a diagnosis from probably stuff that they've never really looked into, never researched fully, thought through what the status of mental imagery has meant, can mean, will mean in the future, right? And they're
Mm.
now saying, well, I don't see anything in their minds. Well, I don't see anything in my mind either. Seeing is something I do when I go to the art gallery. Seeing is something I do right now. Imagination is what I do in my mind. I don't think anybody has a clear definition of what it means to imagine. It can mean all kinds of different things to all kinds of different people. And yet at the same time, it can't mean different things. Because for us to say, "Hey, do you know what your imagination is?" And you go, "Yeah, I do." Well, that means that it means the same thing, more or less, right? So
Mm.
sameness, difference, these are all fun concepts to intellectually noodle over. But I think that,
Yeah.
yes, maybe there are some people who literally have no imagination. And yet, how is that possible? How is it possible for you to have space in your mind where we could have a conversation and you are symbolically decoding what I have understood as words and you have understood as words, and they're passing in real time between us to the point that you can say, "Yeah, I remember a time when I was in a parking lot and somebody said, 'Hey, you're like that, your name is like that guy in Jaws,'" right? Like how could you be transmitting that information to me without memory, without an imagination that is exactly the same as mine? These transmissions work because we're the same, not because we're different, because mental imagery is the same between us.
That is so funny because what it reminds me of is why so many people believe in personality tests that have no empirical backing. Like, for instance, the MBTI personality test. I believe one of the big reasons people believe in the personality they get assigned is because they read the personality assessment, and they're like, that's me. I see one, they see like one thing that resonates with them, and they're like, that's my personality right there. And the funny thing is that you can always find something with every single one of the personalities that resonates with you, because they're describing human beings. Like if you read something that says, sometimes you get tired when you talk to people, but sometimes you don't get tired. And it's like, that's dire describing me right there. But well, yeah, of course they're describing me, because that everyone sometimes gets tired when they're talking to people. Everyone sometimes doesn't.
Oh yeah, I used
So
to
I
do,
think you have a good point.
when I was in grad school and a little bit past grad school, a couple of years after grad school, I did magic shows and mentalism. I used to do mind reading stuff in front of an audience, and I used to say the same thing to like every show, and I'd get somebody up. I do like some subtle gullibility tests just to make sure that whoever I was getting up was suggestible, and I would always say the same thing. So I'm getting an image of you having had an accident somewhere in your backyard with water involved somehow. Like, who on earth hasn't had an accident in their backyard? And then, speaking of systems, you just memorize a simple algorithm, right? So the algorithm is, when they say no, you say no, but, and then you add something else. When they say yes, you say yes, and you add something else. So, you can make it look like you are reading minds so easily, because if they say no, I never had a accident in my backyard with water, no, but you have had an accident somewhere in your backyard, right? And then if they continue, no, but you had an accident with water somewhere, I mean, I'm getting this. And then eventually you'll get a yes, and then you go and you just nail that, and you go, yes, and there's an address across the street that has a 2 in it, right? And it's like, it's almost impossible for someone to have an address that doesn't have a 2 in it somewhere across the street. Like it's just like almost unheard of that nobody has. Anyway, that's a thing that you can do. Now, I always started off my shows and ended them by saying that I'm going to completely just be doing stuff that has nothing to do with psychic powers. I have none. But then people would try to convince me that actually I must have psychic powers. I'll never forget one woman, young woman, hanging around after one of these demonstrations, haranguing me that I had to meet her mother, because her mother also had special talents like this. And I said, look, I told you during the show, and I'm telling you now, I just made all that stuff up based on a memorized algorithm. And anyway, it proves a lot of sameness. It's not difference at all. Well, speaking of personality, though, do you have a sense of what kind of personality you do have?
Yeah. So, first off, that story was so funny. Oh my God.
Well, it's
I
sad.
love how they tried to convince you that you had magic powers when you literally told them you didn't at the beginning. Oh man. When I did do the personality, the MBTI test, I was said to be ENJF. And I think while what I did say about the personalities before, like, you read them and you're like, that's me. I do think I am a little, like, I do think that they're, in very broad summary, can describe some like aspects of different people's personalities. Like I am more extroverted than most people generally are. So I think like in that way, they can help you veer towards a certain dimension. But are they going to be actually like completely accurate? Of course not. But it's still fun to talk about.
Yeah, I find it really interesting. I heard Shinzen Young, who is a meditation teacher. He wrote The Science of Enlightenment, really great book. He said something I never forgot, which is, he said, when you're enlightened, the only thing that remains is personality, which I think is very, very compelling. And I think Ocean,
Yeah.
I mean, some people say that there's no empirical evidence for Ocean either, but I think Ocean is a fairly useful tool. And
Ooh.
you know, that's one of the problems is the treatment of the tool for its, admittedly limited outcomes, but outcomes nonetheless that can be useful in certain contexts, versus this almost scientism level of belief that science must, produce outcomes because or not, like it has to be one way or the other. It can't possibly be that there's a use value of a thing that has emerged because somebody thought there must be some use behind this thing, and maybe they're exaggerating how it can be used or what use it has. So yeah, we got to always be careful to navigate these waters. Tread carefully, because it also happens in memory. And do you feel that there's an exaggerated level of claims for the techniques, or do you think it's more or less just about right?
Mm, mm. Oh, I think it depends upon the person that you're talking to or that you hear the techniques from. Like, I think you did a you do a good job inside of the talking about the magnetic memory method, like really showing people that it's not going to be instant, like, oh, they can just memorize anything they want in literally a millisecond. Like, it's going to take hard work, but the hard work will pay off. I think where it's a little bit less honest is when you go online and you look at some of the other YouTube videos about the memory palace, and it's like a 5 minute video, and it's like the thumbnail is like memorize anything instantaneously in 5 minutes. And then you click on the video and it's about the memory palace technique, which if you've not used before, you're not going to be able to memorize something instantly.
Right,
So
right.
I think it really depends upon the person.
Do you find it work though? I mean, you use that word. I don't really find it work. I find it more like play, but play is not without its effort. So is that a Freudian slip, or do you mean hard work?
No, I think you're right. I think that it it depends upon the time at which you asked me for, like, when I had started using it. I think with a lot of passions, they don't start out as passions. They start out as something that you're just bad at, and then you cultivate the passion for it because you get better at it, and then it becomes super fun. And I think that's kind of how the memory palace was for me. Is like when I first started using it, it was a very difficult. It felt like I was to use a term from the flow, the psychology of experience, I was out of my Goldilocks zone. Like the challenge was way higher than my skill level, and it was uncomfortable. I felt anxious even. But then, as I started getting better at it, and I started adopting better mindsets towards it, it did start to become play, and now it's so fun. Like now, whenever I hear someone talk about how much they don't like memorizing for class, I'm like, no, learn the memory palace. It's so much fun. It's joyous even, I would say. So I totally agree with you that it for me it's become more like play the more that I've done it.
Well, very good. So I don't know anything about Obsidian, and I would revert to you to maybe bring all this together for those who are interested in tethering together ancient memory with either specifically Obsidian or a tool like that.
Mm-hmm.
What do you advise to get started? Then what would be like an intermediate snag or something like that? And how do you overcome that obstacle?
Ooh, that's a great question. So to get started, I would firstly advise a few mindsets that I think I would have liked to have had before getting into the memory palace technique meshed with digital note taking. The first is that there is no perfect note taking tool. So you might as well pick one and then stick to it for at least 6 months, and only then decide if it's time to switch. Because the worst thing you could do is hop and hop and hop and hop from tool to tool to tool to tool, thinking the tool is what matters, when the tool is auxiliary to the mindset that you come towards your practice with and the methods you use. So I think the tool is less important than the mindsets and the methods. So if Obsidian doesn't happen to be the tool that resonates with you, I'm not going to be offended. use a different tool. So that's the first mindset, I would say. The second mindset that I think you should have is your second brain is not the same as your first brain. What I mean by second brain is the external world. Like when you externalize your thoughts into writing, in this case into Obsidian or another digital note-taking system, they are now outside of you. So just because you put something inside of Obsidian does not mean it's in your first brain, right? I can't tell you the amount of people that take notes in my classes in like Google Drive or something, and they'll type everything the professor says verbatim, thinking that it's going to just like magically come into their brain. That's not how it works. So like that's why I think that I used the term earlier, download your second brain into your first brain, with purposely using the memory palace technique in some of the notes that I have. That's what I mean, is like, you need to still put in the effort to get it into your first brain. You can't just write it down. So those are two mindsets. And then the third thing I would say, the thing I'll round it off with, is pick an app. Just literally go online, search up personal knowledge management apps, find one that sounds good after like 30 minutes, an hour of research, stick to it for 6 months, and then figure out how to do the memory palace technique. I would suggest you watch Anthony VA's videos, or do the magnetic memory, join the magnetic memory method community, because the magnetic memory method course was probably the most helpful in learning the techniques myself. Like the whole section you have on memory palaces was really spicy in a good way. And the third thing that I think goes with all of that is trust in the process. Like, realize that it's going to take time in order to learn the memory palace technique and also get used to this digital note-taking system, and try and just allocate like 15 minutes a day, right? As you and Tony Bazan say, the rules will set you free, right? Do 15 minutes and say that is like, that's what you have to do. And if you can just do 15 minutes of note taking or of the memory, making a memory palace a day, you're good, right? 15 minutes over 6 months, that's more than most people do ever. So yeah, those are the three things that I would say could help people get started.
Yeah, that's pretty much going to be a preemptive strike against any obstacles that arise anyway, if you're willing to do that. Well, thank you for your wisdom, and really appreciate it. And everybody should visit you. What have you got coming up next, and where can they find you?
Yeah, so you can find me on YouTube. Just search up Aidan Helfant YouTube. On Twitter, also Aidan Helfant. On my podcast, Personal Knowledge Management with Aidan Helfant, which I actually interviewed you on. So if they wanted to see you on that, they could visit that episode. And also my newsletter, Aidan's Infinite Play, and my blogging website, aidanhelfant.com. Thank you so much for having me on, Anthony. It was absolute pleasure, especially after having you on my podcast a few months ago, and delving also into some of the people you've interviewed. I got to interview Dr. Lynn Kelly on the podcast as well, which was phenomenal. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. We'll talk again soon, I'm sure. Well, I want to thank Aidan again for joining us in this episode of the Magnetic Memory Method podcast. As always, the most important thing to do is take these different tools that you learn about, these different strategies, and really give them the good old college try. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean at least 90 days of exploration and application. Thanks again to Aidan. Thanks to you for being part of this. And I can't wait to have another episode of the Magnetic Memory Method podcast ready to go for you. And that will come very, very soon. So until we have a chance to speak again, thank you again and talk to you soon. And keep yourself magnetic.